April 12, 1944. Over northern France, at 25,000 feet, the sky was cold and bright, and the war looked at a distance like an argument between clouds. The sound of engines was thin and crystalline as glass. A German pilot in the rear cockpit laughed under his mask, the breath fogging the glass. A small contempt that passed among the formation like a private joke. They had names for the Americans' machines that were kinder in the bar than on the report sheet. They called them bulky and slow and easy. They did not yet know what name fear would give them. Below, the sun glanced off metal like a promise, and above that, the day smelled faintly of oil and primer and the copper tang of ammunition. In the cockpit of the American escort, the leader tightened his grip on the stick and tasted the bitter coffee left from the pre-flight. He listened to the engines like a man listening to a heart. He had a nickname for his airplane that friends in the squadron used when they wanted to make a point without saying it out loud. It was large and obstinate and carried its mass like a statement. To the enemy, it was a target. To the men who flew it, it was a machine that promised to change the calculation of survival. This is the story of how laughter became silence under a hail of lead, and how a design that invited mockery became the instrument that made a new kind of airspace lethal. We will trace design choices trench by trench, talk to pilots at their worst moments, open factory doors and read pages of reports to understand how a turbocharged radial engine, a heavy airframe, and a carrying load of .50 caliber rounds together rewrote the rules of combat. The opening is a scene of misjudgment and an immediate transformation, and the promise here is simple: the expected is about to be overturned. In a cramped engineering room in mid-1942, the specification read like a challenge. The requirement called for endurance, escort range, heavy armament, and survivability at altitude. The team that answered was not thinking of elegance. They sketched a fighter that looked at first glance more like a light bomber than a classic pursuit craft. The chief designer, Martin Hale, argued for a robust Pratt Whitney radial engine for reliability, a turbocharger to reclaim power at high altitude, and broad wings to carry fuel and ammunition. His partner, Ruth Carter, insisted on armor plating around the cockpit and self-sealing tanks for the crew. They debated in clipped sentences and coffee-stained drawings until the configuration took on a near-organic logic. The market of doctrine and pilots trained to value tight turning fights reacted with skepticism. Test pilots called the new fighter clumsy, and maintenance crews called it thirsty. But behind the skepticism was a calculus of numbers that engineers loved. Rate of production mattered, torque mattered, rate of fire and the capacity to absorb damage while returning home were not romantic, but they were decisive. A memos page quoted a statistic that would later haunt cockpits. The service expected a rate of production that could deliver thousands of units, while an individual aircraft might weigh several thousand pounds more than a contemporary light fighter. It was a bet on industry, not finesse. The reaction in briefing rooms ranged from derision to private curiosity, and a young squadron commander named James Hartley said in a meeting that the machine would be tested in the worst place possible, the beating heart of contest with enemy fighters protecting heavy bombers. The first prototype left the ground in a low sun with a nervous engineer strapped in as observer. The test flight revealed quirks that no drawing could predict. The plane climbed with a steady stubbornness, the turbocharger delivering power that seemed almost dishonest at altitude. Yet the controls felt like different hands at speed, and the canopy created a greenhouse effect the pilot could feel on his skin. A test pilot named Frank Miller radioed short, clipped comments to the engineers below. The landing was rough, and the undercarriage complained. For all its mass, the plane surprised with a burst of acceleration in a straight sprint, and its guns had a response that made rangefinders blank. Pilots of the prototype discovered that the design required different reflexes, not more aggression. In ensemble, the test squad added names to faults and remedies, and the aircraft returned to the factory for stiffening and adjustment. The engineers learned to treat the turbocharger not as an accessory, but as the heartbeat that compensated for the plane's bulk, a subtle trade-off between weight and altitude performance. Pilots whispered about its ability to deliver a concentrated cone of fire, and the first reports called that cone nasty and effective. Training started on fields that smelled of dust and burned oil, and the crude geometry of learning left marks. The initial accident rate was a sharp and bitter number on the logbooks. New pilots were inexperienced with the mass and the torque, and a few control stalls ended in burnt metal. The training officer, Major Thompson, read incident reports in a voice that made the room smaller. He assigned a roster of mentors, including Johnson and Alvarez, to pair with rookies, and insisted on exercises that emphasized straight-line attacks and diving runs rather than turning dogfights. There were 10 exchanges of questions and answers in one training debrief that stretched into an argument and then into a lesson. A rookie asked why they could not turn like the enemy, and an old pilot named Samuel Briggs answered, "Because we do not want to be in a turning fight. We want to make a lane of fire and stay alive." The unit kept a ledger of losses, and after a month the numbers were grim but instructive. The accident log showed a reduction as modification. New pilots were inexperienced with the mass and the torque, and a few control stalls ended in burnt metal. The training officer, Major Thompson, read incident reports in a voice that made the room smaller. He assigned a roster of mentors, including Johnson and Alvarez, to pair with rookies, and insisted on exercises that emphasized straight-line attacks and diving runs rather than turning dogfights. There were 10 exchanges of questions and answers in one training debrief that stretched into an argument and then into a lesson. A rookie asked why they could not turn like the enemy, and an old pilot named Samuel Briggs answered, "Because we do not want to be in a turning fight. We want to make a lane of fire and stay alive." The unit kept a ledger of losses, and after a month the numbers were grim but instructive. The accident log showed a reduction as modification. To controls and revised training took effect, and the men adapted. The adaptation cost men and metal. In the mess hall, voices traded names like talismans. Hartley, Miller, Carter, Briggs, Alvarez, Weber, and Schmidt became part of the instruction. Each name carried an anecdote and a fix, and the lessons were braided into habit. The early months were about endurance and about accepting that being heavy could be taught into an advantage. The first real combat that would be recorded in enemy memory came on a morning when bomber streams cast long shadows over occupied territory. The escort group flew tight with bombers that smelled of aviation fuel and anxiety below. Enemy fighters approached with confident chatter on the radio. The German squadron mocked as they closed, calling the American fighters slow and fat. In the cockpit, Hartley and Miller exchanged terse commands as targets split and the world shrank to the horizon and the sound of guns. The moment of impact happened in a flurry of near stops and starts. Enemy tracer formed curtains in the air, and the P-47's guns opened up in a wall of fire that moved like a tide. The initial shock on the enemy side was audible later in captured radio logs. A simple interjection, a long pause, and then the abrupt order to break off. Damage reports after the sortie recorded dozens of enemy aircraft hit, some falling burning, others limping back. The bomber losses that day were lower than the previous average by a startling margin. In a 2-paragraph report, a commander wrote that the concentration of .50 caliber fire at closing range created a saturation effect that overwhelmed enemy defensive maneuvers. That encounter changed the conversation. The laugh that had followed the sight of the big fighters went quiet, and the Germans began to use other words, a tone of respect growing in capture chatter. The men who flew these frames for the first time felt a strange vindication and an unfamiliar sorrow for the men who had been lost in early trials.
After that first confrontation, tactics evolved fast in ways that read like a manual in motion. The squadron shifted from seeking dogfights to exploiting climb and diving runs, an approach that leveraged the plane's structural strength and firepower rather than maneuverability. Leaders like Hartley and a tactical officer named Klaus Bauer developed a tactic where pilots would use altitude to gain speed, dive through an attacking band, continue the run, and climb out using the turbocharger to recover. In a sequence of missions, the technique known later in pilot speech as boom and zoom, but described here as climb, dive, accelerate, strike, and escape, became a doctrine. The change included radio protocols and escort formations reworked by Commander Ernst Weber. A mission transcript shows a dozen short radio exchanges coordinating altitude windows and firing arcs, the precision of a clockwork. The effect was to create bursts of concentrated fire where the enemy could not
respond with the same mass of coordinated attacks. A factory foreman, Harold Briggs, would later comment that the plane was never meant to be graceful. It was meant to be a platform for sustained, concentrated, lethal fire. The citation from a veteran pilot quoted in an after-action report was stark. "We were not graceful. We were damn effective." Tactical evolution turned awkwardness into advantage, and it did so quickly because the design permitted it and industry could supply the numbers. Production scaled in a story of belts and stamps and human rhythm. Factories around 4 major plants organized shifts to build airframes, engines, and mount guns at a rate that reassured generals and terrified enemy planners. The numbers mattered. Monthly output rose into the hundreds, then the thousands, with a logistics chain that funneled barrels, ammo, and replacement engines to airfields. The commodity that mattered as much as parts was fuel, because the heavy fighters were thirsty. Supply officers kept lists of consumption rates and flying hours, and a note from an operations log spelled out how squadrons scheduled sorties to allow for maintenance cycles and fuel loads without overextending crews. A short technical aside explains turbocharger operation in plain terms. The turbocharger used the energy of exhaust gases to compress intake air, restoring engine power at altitude, creating consistent performance where naturally aspirated engines lost output at high altitude. This device allowed the radial engine to retain usable thrust and enabled the plane to carry heavier loads without losing its ability to climb. The explanation illustrates why the power plant was central, not peripheral. Factories installed jigs and stamping presses and night shifts, and the output numbers altered strategic options. The enemy had to count not only pilots, but the volume of production and the flow of ammunition. The sustainment of escort numbers became a strategic pressure point. As production fed squadrons, the plane found uses far beyond the initial escort role. Ground attack loads of rockets and bombs were added in theaters farther south, where armored columns and supply depots became priority targets. Pilots adapted the cockpit to carry maps and cameras, and men from other units learned how the platform could loiter and then deliver concentrated fire on a pinpoint. Missions over coastal convoys showed the plane could serve as a long-range protector, where its endurance allowed it to accompany ships well beyond the horizon. In another theater in Italy, a pilot named David Cole flew a mission with modified fuel tanks and returned with a report of strafes that disabled a logistics train. The versatility extended to night patrols, where added navigation lights and radar detectors allowed for limited interdiction missions. At sea, the machine proved useful escorting slow cargo vessels and deterring enemy torpedo bombers. Testimony from an adversary officer captured later described how the plane's presence changed enemy planning. They could not risk massed attacks in zones where the escorts could establish a curtain of fire. The adaptation to multiple roles increased the aircraft's profile and left survivors and witnesses who described the sound of its engines as a warning and its guns as a chorus. Within the narrative, there are moments of tension that slow the pace and show human conflict. One such moment occurred when a rookie pilot misread the approach and stalled on final approach in a crosswind. The aircraft bounced and skidded in a way that made everyone hold their breath. The radio crackled with orders and apologies, and the ground crew ran with fire extinguishers. The memory of that day lingered in the flight logs, and in a later interview, the rookie spoke of the smell of hot rubber and crying men. Another tension came on a mission where Hartley's wingman took a hit and the hydraulic pressure fell. The undercarriage would not retract, and the enemy was circling the sky. Felt heavy with smoke, and he had to choose whether to break for home or draw fire away, deliberate choices condensed into seconds. In both scenarios, the narrative dwelt on small details: grease on a wrench, the exact sound of a failing pump, the weight of guilt and duty. A third tensionful passage recorded a night where a mechanical failure left a formation exposed to fighters, and a pilot named Miller made a decision to lead the enemy away, sacrificing his route home to save the bombers. The account slowed to list his last words over the radio and the smell of cordite in his throat. Each of these moments lasted long enough in the telling to show how procedure and courage met and sometimes did not align. Technical explanations appear through the story at moments where procedures mattered. One such procedural description describes gun convergence and ammunition feed in accessible terms. The guns were set to converge at a set distance so that rounds from separate barrels would intersect, forming a concentrated zone of effect. Maintenance crews timed belts and inspected feed chutes to prevent jams, and calculated rates of fire to predict barrel heating and reload intervals. These checks mattered because in a heat of a short engagement, one jam could mean the difference between holding the line and losing an escort. The description is practical and meant for understanding, not mastery. Another procedural account detailed how crews managed self-sealing tanks after hits using patch kits and how armor panels were replaced on the field, a small choreography of men and tools under pressure. The story is populated by named voices who carry the human thread. James Hartley is the protagonist, a squadron commander who learned in classrooms and airfields and whose backstory explains his devotion. He grew up in a factory town, son of a machinist who taught him the feel of metal and the smell of oil. As a child, he listened to stories of a father at a lathe, and he learned to value steady work and precise measurement. His training in the early war years was arduous. Interrupted by the loss of a brother in naval action, a pain that pushed him toward a sense of duty and a belief that actions mattered more than reputation. At 25, he joined the Air Corps and excelled, not because he loved danger, but because he respected the machine and wanted to protect others. He lost friends in early sorties, and each loss reshaped him, sometimes hardened him, sometimes made him quieter at the table. In the present, he carried those memories into the cockpit and into decisions he made for his men. That backstory traces childhood, schooling, apprenticeship, a personal loss, and the present commitment, giving the protagonist a human arc and a private logic that explains his choices. Secondary characters appear by name and action across the narrative. Frank Miller, the test pilot who learned to read an engine's mood and later paid with his life in a daring mission. Ruth Carter, the engineer who argued for armor and whose notebooks show the earliest design justifications. Samuel Briggs, the mentor who taught rookies to trust, climb, and dive, and who once patched an aircraft with his own hands. Klaus Bauer, the tactical officer who translated doctrine into radio commands. Ernst Weber, the commander who pushed for production targets and coordinated with logistics. Johnson and Alvarez, the paired training mentors who saved more than one new pilot from a stall. Harold Briggs, the foreman in the factory who counted output by the hour and refused to accept excuses. David Cole, the pilot who modified fuel tanks and returned with photographs that proved a point. Each name appears with a small anecdote or recorded action, making the community of the aircraft visible and specific. There are several climaxes in the theater of operations, each showing a different facet of transformation. One recounting lasts several paragraphs and slows the narrative to a close inspection of sensory detail and decision. Enemy fighters massed in a way that suggested a coordinated counter, the sky filled with tracers, and the air tasted metallic. Hartley radioed precise coordinates and felt the vibration of his guns when they discharged.
The target became a point of light and then a map of smoke. The tension of those minutes was measured in breaths and firing bursts, and later in the tally of damaged aircraft and rescued crews. Another climax happened when a factory received reports of a new tactic by the enemy and responded with a quick change to ammunition belts and armor placement, a logistical ballet that required trucks, shift changes, and quick modifications to blueprints. A third critical confrontation occurred in a coastal operation where long endurance allowed escorts to intercept torpedo bombers at range, changing the calculus of risk and saving a convoy. Each confrontation is rendered with at least 2 paragraphs of slow description, focusing on sound and sight and smell and internal deliberation. At roughly 1/3 into the story, pause here to take part in the conversation.
A reaction. If you were surprised by the reversal from ridicule to respect, tell us in the comments which factor you think mattered most. Was it raw power armor or production capacity? Type power armor or production in one word and briefly say why. The best comments may be featured in a future episode and will help shape our next investigation. Now the narrative resumes to follow consequences and the spread of this design across theaters. As time passed, the aircraft's presence influenced strategy and politics. Air commanders began to plan missions assuming escort numbers that could sustain heavier bomber operations. Planners shifted targets knowing that long-range escort reduced bomber losses and opened the door to deep penetration raids. On the diplomatic front, the demonstrable reduction in losses affected negotiation of resources and budget, and the industrial momentum created a political constituency for further funding. Enemy intelligence reports shifted from mocking tone to worried analysis, noting that the combination of rate of production and concentrated ordnance created an asymmetry that could not be met with incremental adjustments. The strategic consequence was clear. The contest had moved from individual dogfight skill to a larger game of sustained production and logistics endurance. The epilogue unfolds in 3 temporal moments, showing the immediate and lingering consequences. 1 month later, units were processing after-action reports, and the first medals were given for actions that saved bomber crews. The mood was a complex weave of relief and grief. Medics wrote notes on wounded men. The mechanical shops tallied replaced parts, and a commander sent a dispatch that the tactic set had proven effective but that losses must still be reduced. Conversations in mess halls noted the silence of enemy radios, and a captured German pilot quoted in a report said, "I remember the sound of their guns, and I knew then we had misjudged them." That month was about recovery and a cautious optimism grounded in the hard fact of repair schedules. 3 months later, the factory lines were smoother and doctrine had been updated. New pilots trained from day 1 to use the tactic of climb, dive, strike, and recover, and the accident rate had dropped. The charts showed increased mission success rates and fewer bomber losses. Letters arrived to families explaining risks, and simultaneously, the voice of veterans started forming the early memory of the campaign. The cultural imprint was small, conversations in bars and telegrams, and a quiet shift in how men told their stories. 6 months on, the impact was clearer. Production had delivered numbers that could not be ignored, and the enemy changed air tactics and diverted resources. The strategic balance shifted incrementally but significantly. Reports recorded hundreds of missions, reduced losses by a measurable fraction, and historians later would point to this period as a turning one where sustained industry and a robust airframe altered the scope of operations. The epilogue shows personal consequences, repairs, memorials, letters, and also the broader effect on strategy and production. The conclusion returns to the opening contrast and recaps the lesson. They laughed at first, and then they learned to speak of the machine with another voice. The transformation was neither purely romantic nor purely mechanical. It was industrial calculation and human adaptation working together. In a single line of synthesis, the victory lay in power, ammunition, and production more than in agility. The consequence, strategic and human, was that theaters of war shifted toward endurance and logistics. An adversary quoted years later said, "When we heard those engines, we felt a new kind of danger." And that phrase captures the final truth. Machines do not fight alone. They amplify the resources and will behind them. If this narrative moved you, subscribe to follow more investigations that combine technical analysis and personal stories, and help preserve the memory of those who designed, built, and flew these machines. The last image lingers on an empty airfield at dusk, the silhouette of an aircraft against a slow, bleeding sun, and the memory of a laugh that turned into silence.